Hey, welcome to What You Missed in Genesis and Why You Should Love This Book. I am Ken Rushing. I am a Genesis Bible nerd. And if you like Genesis or are interested in it, please join me in this amazing study. If you didn't watch part one, I would encourage you to watch the previous one. This is part two of a bazillion episodes. So, hopefully, within less than a bazillion, we'll get finished with chapter one. Sort of joking. So, last week I'm kind of reviewing what we covered. Not last week, but last time we did we did this. We've been inhibited by foul weather, so I've been trying to not make these until I meet with my Bible study, so we can do that first, so they don't have to feel like they're being recorded. And so I can make a separate recording for those that missed that lesson. So last lesson we looked at what is the book of Genesis. We talked about how it was an ancient book. It's dense, layered, and complicated. It's written as a novel. It's full of word plays. We looked at who wrote Genesis and the different ideas behind that and why it was a lengthy work, not just a one moment piece of work. Um, so, and then we talked about whether these are real stories or not. My personal humble opinion is, God could do whatever he wants. I have no problem with God creating the world as we know it in 6 days and resting on the seventh. He could have done it in just a snap of the finger. But I like to think, at least, or imagine, like the ancient readers did, that there is there's actually some real event behind this. So, but I'm not going to pigeonhole or overly debate anyone. I typically, unfortunately, as my wife will tell you, I play the devil's advocate often, and so whatever position you're going to take, I'm going to argue with you the other way. so, so anyway, yeah, I'm that guy. So the second lesson is called What They Knew That We Don't. Speaking they as being the ancient readers, the audience that originally would have received Genesis, and it was written to them. It wasn't written to us in the 21st century, but it's written for us. So, a good way of trying to understand its interpretation and what God is trying to communicate with us is to begin to understand it as more of an ancient reader, and because God is going to meet people right where they're at. And so, as this was created, it was to a specific audience that had certain assumptions about the world, and so we need to enter their world and their context to understand what Genesis is communicating. Anyway, so what they knew that we don't. So here I write, in the past, many other creation stories, like Babylonian creation stories, Egyptian, um, Persian, Assyrian, all these other creations, Canaanite, all these other creation stories were seen as a threat to the Bible. It seemed like it was that way, at least back in the 70s and 80s. In the 80s, at least when I was going to college, and it was because they thought that the Bible had copied these creation stories because they were so similar, and there was debate who's the oldest and all that stuff. I'm not going to get into all that, but now better studies have shown that that was really the wrong conclusion. A better conclusion is that the Bible didn't necessarily take or steal these pieces of stories from other ancient literature, but that they all share a common worldview and shared similar stories. And so Israel and Babylon and Canaan and Egypt would have all been familiar with each other's creation stories. And they all arise from this common worldview, ancient Near Eastern worldview. And you can discover that as you read other creation stories in the ancient Near East, along with the Hebrew creation story in Genesis. So hopefully I haven't lost you yet. So we have, but what's important to note is to look at the differences and the similarities between these creation stories. And so these differences play an important role in explaining the purpose of humanity, the nature of God, and how it differs from other nations and other gods. So these aren't just children's stories that you'd read to them at night. It is very foundational in shaping a worldview of who I am, what am I here for, why is the world a mess, is there any hope? And so, anyway, I go on to say, like the Genesis story, the Egyptian creation account found in the Book of the Dead and pyramid texts begin with a mountain rising from a vast primordial ocean. Their god, Khnum, also as a potter, creates humanity, but from the silt of the Nile and giving the breath of life. But this is kind of where the similarities end, because there are similarities in what I just read to you in the Genesis account. But the great, forgive me if I know I'm pronouncing all these names wrong. The great Enid Atum is a group of 9 creator gods that create another 8 gods, and these deities represent various elements of nature like darkness. Like there's a god over the darkness, there's a god over the ocean, there's a god over the wind, and there's a god over the sun. And so their creation account primarily focuses on the creation of the gods and paid little attention to the creation of humanity. The purpose of humanity is to serve the gods. So the important players in this creation account are the gods. And since Pharaoh is a son of a god, the purpose of every Egyptian is to serve and give worship to the king. So as an ancient reader, you're very familiar with this Egyptian story. I mean, these were all neighbors. They didn't live in a vacuum. They traded with one another. They moved in and out of each other's lands. And so what does this tell you about their gods? That is the question that I have. Some observances that you might make is that these gods, whoever wrote the creation story, saw that the gods were the most valuable or the most important pieces of creation. Also, they all have their own specialties. There's not a god over everything. Each god has their own specialty, like god of the wind or god of the sun or god of this or fertility or whatever. They all have these different things. And it sounds like to me they have a bit of an ego, because the reason why humanity is created is to serve the gods. And so what do these ancient texts tell us about who we are? Well, basically we're just little peons meant to serve the gods. So it justified when Pharaoh wanted one of my daughters as part of his concubine. I mean, I just give her to Pharaoh. I mean, because he's God, and my purpose is to serve the gods. And so this tells us basically what our purpose is in life. My purpose is to serve the government, the king, in our context, the president. Not sure if that's what we want to think of as our purpose in life. I'm sure certain presidents would love to have that idea. Not being political, I'm just saying. So that's the Egyptian account. That's in a nutshell. It's much more complicated than that. But you can look a lot of these stories up over the internet. Another popular creation account Israel would have been familiar with is the Babylonian Enuma Elish, where creation is born from a violent conflict between the gods. The gods are worried, angry, jealous, and quick-tempered, which throws them into a drinking binge. And so they all get blasted, drunk, And this is because a rival god dragon monster named Tiamat has risen from the chaotic primordial ocean. And in their distress, they agree to make Marduk their most high god so that he would confront Tiamat. In a climactic war, Marduk destroys Tiamat and cuts her in half. Marduk is the god of the wind, and what he does, he blows into Tiamat's mouth. Tiamat is this Leviathan chaos monster in the water, dragon thing. And so Marduk is kind of more human looking, and he blows into the mouth, opens the mouth of Tiamat, shoots an arrow, if I remember right, into her mouth, and then he splits her in half. With one half, he creates the sky, and the other half, he creates the land. And he then divides 300 gods to live in the sky and 600 gods to live on the earth. And one of the gods is chosen to be a sacrifice, and from his blood, humanity is created. As the blood falls from the sky, it hits the dust and springs up humanity. So later, the gods create bricks to build Babylon and build a massive tower to be the throne of Marduk. There's another similar story of that in Genesis. Very different, though. Because their world was created out of violence, it justified their own violence against one another. So what does this tell us about their gods? If you were trying to live up to the standards of those gods, the bar isn't very high. You can be jealous, angry, quick-tempered, and get drunk any day of the week, and you're just like the gods, So these gods are fickle. You don't know what they want. They are moody. They are angry, and it would create some anxiety in me as a worshiper of these Babylonian gods. But what does this ancient account tell us about who we are? Basically, we are born out of violence. We're born out of that the whole of creation was made because of this violent act between the gods and Tiamat and all these things that were going on. And so it would justify if I wanted to be violent against my wife, or if I wanted to be violent against my children or my neighbor or another nation. After all, this is just the way creation was. So it would justify all of these things. You'll notice, of course, in the Genesis account, it's very peaceful because the God of the Bible is communicating to humanity, no, we work best when things are at peace, when there is no conflict. And creation was made of no conflict. There are no rivals to God in Genesis, or even in the Bible for that matter. The rivals that do appear, these are rivals against creation. God has no rivals, okay? No one could match him. But anyway, that's for your theology class. So I know this is a lot of crazy stuff, but knowing how other nations believe the world was created is important because Genesis tells us a very different story about what God is like, and who we are and what purpose we have. And as we'll soon discover, humanity has an entirely different purpose than producing bricks and wives for Pharaoh. We are more than servants to those in authority. So let me just ask you and have you reflect, what do you think God is like? I mean, when you imagine God, what is he like? Is he like any of these gods that we read about, or what is he like? And then what do you feel like is your purpose, who you are and what your purpose is in life? And is it the same as what these other creation accounts have? And if it's very different, then where are you getting your opinions from? And I would bet most likely you may be getting them from Genesis and not even realizing it. So we're going to dive a little deeper next week into Genesis chapter 1. So if you listen to the first lesson, the question that I posed for you to look at as you read Genesis 1 and 2 as a narrative, looking for where God says, where he gives a blessing and when he doesn't give a blessing and when he says it's good and when he omits those phrases. So, yeah. So I thought I had it all figured out until one of our teens at church kind of asked some really tough questions, and now I don't have the answer for those as well as I did. So thanks, Kelly. But anyway, the what you'll notice is some of the rabbis will say, I think it's somewhere around verse 22 in chapter 1 where it talks about the that God created the swarming things, the flying things, the swimming things, and then after he talks about, he says that it's good, and then he says, and the Lord blessed these. But then when it goes on to the next part and talks in the next few verses about God creating the animals and the beasts of the field and the creeping things, God says it's good, but he never does bless it. And so there are some rabbis that I've read that have said the reason why is you're supposed to pay attention. It's not that God has favorites, but you're supposed to notice that he does not bless the beasts of the field, because you'll see in chapter 3, the serpent is considered one of the beasts of the field that is like the chaos monster that has come to come against humanity in Genesis 3. So anyway, I am going over this. This is stuff I've studied for many years, and so I feel like I'm just doing a theological dump on you guys. A lot of information, trying to drink out of a fire hose. So that's where we are. The next lesson is going to be, we're going to go verse to verse in Genesis chapter 1. So if you want to review that, what I told the class, pay attention to what God is doing in Genesis 1, because it's not that God is creating something out of nothing. The way the ancient world understood it, and I forgot to bring the book that I was going to promote, and I think some of this is in John Walton's book. It's called Genesis. I forgot what it's called. Genesis 1. The life or something of Genesis 1. Anyway, look up John Walton, and it's kind of academic. He gives like 16 propositions, and then he argues how he thinks each of those propositions are correct. So it's not like super easy reading, but you'll get it. It's just written kind of academic. So, but that's what John Walton does. John Walton is like a crazy academic professor that's from Wheaton College and just really dives in on this stuff. So, but what I was going to say is he helps explain that to an ancient world, creation isn't like what we understand. We think of creation, we think of something created from nothing, like there's nothing there and then bam, it's there. But even in the Genesis account, you'll recognize there's something already there. Because to the ancients, creation was more about order and function rather than something out of nothing. So what you're going to notice in Genesis 1 is that God is going to create spaces for different things. It's like he's going to build a house with different rooms, and then on the first 3 days, and then the next 3 days, he's going to fill those rooms, those spaces that he created. And that is considered order and function. And by him speaking what they are, it gives them a purpose. And so, yeah, but we'll go more into that the next lesson. Anyway, I hope I haven't confused you too much. I hope you love Genesis and the Bible as much as I do. Please, if you want, feel free to send me a little message or something, whether you like it, hate it, whatever. I'm strong enough, I think. Just be gentle. But anyway, thank you so much for joining me, and I hope that this has been of some help to you. Anyway, y'all take care. Have a good day.